That sort of leads in, I was going to ask what sort of the evidence is for when the hominids essentially became non-hairy or naked or switched their hair to the opposite. Because if you're working with fossil records, I would imagine, but maybe that feeds off what you're just saying about the thermoregulation.
Gosh,
so we know when that happened.
So the question is, when did we lose our hair from our bodies, most of it, and why?
So that there's, again, a diversity of opinion. And the time frame is very divergent. So there's one hypothesis that Peter Wheeler has put forward, whereby it occurs very early in human evolution, and it goes along with bipedalism basically being adaptive, at least in part for thermoregulatory purposes, and losing the hair basically is one of the beneficial things about it is it allows cooling in sort of more open areas where you've got wind. That's one hypothesis, which puts it very early. Recently, Mark Pagel and Walter Bodmer have argued that actually it's quite a late phenomenon, and that it's linked with clothing, and it's in particular linked with parasites, so ectoparasites. So they argue that when clothing is adopted, ectoparasites start to become a really major problem, and that there's then selection for loss of hair. And the first evidence we've got for clothing is really quite late. We're talking about in the last 40,000 years. It's probably not unreasonable to think about that happening a bit earlier, probably with the origins of modern humans, perhaps. But we've got two very, very different perspectives on hairlessness. So we've got a very early one that links it to bipedalism, essentially, and a much later one that links it to clothing. And so we're basically discussing these two hypotheses at this point.
Can I just have a follow-up to that? Did Neanderthals wear clothing? And they did on your slide there. Right?
We have evidence for Neanderthals having scraped hides. We don't have at this point any evidence for the sort of devices we might expect to find for them for them making clothes, like needles. We have that for early anatomically modern humans, post 40,000 in Europe. There's clear evidence for needle use, for the production of needles, which implies sewn clothing. So whether Neanderthals were just sort of wrapping themselves in fur rugs, or whether they were actually making clothes, and we just don't see evidence for that, is an open question. But at the moment, we've got evidence for the scraping of hides. We don't have evidence for the production of clothing.
All right. So at the back there, yes, madam.
I am not a very experienced traveler, but just in my limited traveling, I have encountered, particularly in Nicaragua, people who are extremely small in stature. I remember running into a woman just by accident who could not have been more than 4 feet tall. She had her several children with her. And later on the same trip, I saw two pairs of two couples. They were both tiny. They were taller than that woman, but they couldn't have been 5 feet tall, and they were also extremely slender. So I just wonder, thinking about Floresiensis, whether I have heard that there is also the theory that they were just malnourished humans.
So the question is, we know that lots of small people, so could Floresiensis, this hobbit woman, actually just have been undernourished?
Well, so the argument that's been made with Floresiensis, it partly revolves around the fact that she's got a very small LB1, the skeleton that's been found, partial skeleton. The brain size is so small. It's a third of what we see in modern humans. So the combination of the small body size and the very small brain size is really the the evidence that people are discussing and trying to explain. So certainly people, the group of folk who come along to these conferences and hammer very hard that we're talking about a pathological individual, they argue that basically we've got a small-bodied individual, much as the sort of person you're describing, who's got a condition, microcephaly, of which there are a number of different sort of causal pathways to get there. So it's this combination of small body size and very small brain size that's the sort of difficult thing to explain, and which they have to invoke, sort of disease essentially to explain the small brain size, but that's sort of built on this small body size. So certainly there are undoubtedly small populations around. One of the things we have to sort of take into account thinking about small populations is the impact of malnutrition. But even aside from that, there are some very small body populations, pygmies for example. They seem to have a particular genetic reason why they're so small. But there are other populations, the Kung Bushmen for example, tend to be pretty small and slender, but still not the size of Lucy for example, or LB1. And the main thing, so the main thing about LB1 is this very, very small brain size linked with this small body size.
And there's only one specimen of Floriensis?
There are other bits and pieces, that they've got. So it's clear she's not aberrant for that population.
That's the thing. Okay, so there's one here and then here, I guess. Yeah.
Dr. Keller, go back to your beginning presentation. When you had like the chimp warfare, chimp tool use, these kind of things. Is there any evidence that you plan, like make tools for to be used for hunting tomorrow? Is that difference potentially significant? Like those tools that the early humans made obviously took a long time and maybe had foresight of like hunting tomorrow. Is that a difference, or?
So do chimps make tools to use later? So do they have foresight? Is that the?
I think that most people would. It sort of breaks down into people who tend to see chimpanzees in very favourable lights in terms of these sort of behaviours, and other people are quite sceptical. I think the consensus would be that there is more evidence for, in the early hominins, with the older one technology, for example, for them actually engaging in some sort of foresight, in some sort of planning. So there's clear evidence for some of these tools being manufactured from stone that's been brought from elsewhere, implying that there's some sort of planning going on. That hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, that sort of thing hasn't been seen with chimpanzees. Okay. But we've not been looking all that hard there aren't that many chimpanzee populations that have been studied in that sort of detail. I mean, it seems one thing we can be pretty sure about is more or less anything we say about chimpanzees today is, in a few years' time, is going to be disproved. But that would, at this point in time, the consensus would be that is in fact potentially a big difference between chimpanzees and the early hominins in terms of the amount of planning depth that they're going into.
Okay, so.
I've heard that. I remember reading one time that the timing of the divergence, the species divergence between human pubic and body lice could give us some clues about when humans lost most of their body hair. Is that legitimate evidence? And if so, which of the two hypotheses does it support?
It's a legitimate. It would be a legitimate analysis to undertake. I don't know whether it's been done. It would certainly be an interesting thing to do.
So can I just?
Yeah.
So the question was that lice, so ectoparasites, the lice that live on hair, there are different species or different forms that live in different parts of your hair, and so there's parts that live on your body hair, lice that live on your body hair, and lice that live on your pubic hair, which we still have. So if you could check and see.
So you can speak for yourself. Yeah.
So you can, if you could figure out when those two types of lice diverged, maybe that would give you some idea as to when. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the way it is, I think that humans have two different species, one living on their heads and one living on their pubes.
That's right.
And I think all other apes have only one species. So the question is, when did those human, and they're all separate species, so when did the two human species diverge?
Okay. Did everybody hear that? So chimps, other apes only have one type of lice. We have two. here and elsewhere. And so the question is, if we could figure out when they diverged, that might tell us a little bit about when we lost the hair in between, so they had to diverge themselves.